All right, good afternoon, Your Excellency and esteemed guests and participants. I am Divya and I will be your MC for this event. I am delighted to welcome you to today's public webinar where we will be discussing on how do land laws impact Malaysia's green economy ambitions. Thank you all for taking the time to join us here today. And before we begin, I'd just like to go over a few things to ensure that the webinar runs smoothly. Firstly, the webinar will be divided into two presentations. Each presentation will take about 30 minutes, followed by a Q&A and discussion session. The first presentation will highlight two research themes titled Green Pledges and Land Categories. This presentation will take about 30 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. The second presentation will include the next research theme, titled Drivers of Forest Loss, along with the care recommendations. This section will also take about 30 minutes, followed by a combined Q&A session, along with an open discussion after, which will take about 40 minutes. Throughout the webinar, you will have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing them into the Q&A feature located in the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will compile these and address them in the Q&A sessions. If you'd rather ask a question in person during the Q&A sessions, you may click on the raise hand icon and someone will unmute you so that you may ask your question. Okay. Now I'm honored to invite His Excellency Charles Hay, British High Commissioner to Malaysia, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Divya, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar. We at the British High Commission in Kuala Lumpur, together with colleagues from the South Asia Research Hub at our High Commission in Delhi, are very pleased to have commissioned this study from RESCU that they're presenting today. Its subject, the role that land laws and regulations play in Malaysia's green ambitions, is very relevant indeed to the growing debate on strengthening climate action in Malaysia. For the UK, of course, climate action is a core element of government policy, as the world saw when we hosted last year's COP26 UN climate conference in Glasgow. And nature and land use was at the heart of these talks in a way that it hasn't previously been. We very much commend Malaysia's commitments made in Glasgow, and it's probably not coincidental that many of these address land use issues. And I wanted to highlight three commitments in particular. Most importantly, the Glasgow leaders' declaration on forests and land use. This brought together 130 world leaders to commit to halting and reversing forest loss and land degradation by 2030. Malaysia has also been an active participant in the 2-year Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogue that brings together producers and consumer countries to work together towards sustainable commodity supply chains. Agriculture, of course, is a big part of land use issues, and we were delighted that Malaysia is participating in the Climate Shot initiative to advance innovation in agriculture, which is also launched at COP26. The role of nature, and thereby land use issues, in sustainable development questions is only going to become more important. Nature will continue to be in the spotlight later this year as states conclude negotiations on a new global biodiversity framework. The UK, along with 100 other countries, are calling for a new ambition for the next decade to protect 30% of the world's surface by 2030. In my 3 years here in Malaysia, I've had the opportunity to see just a glimpse of Malaysia's natural beauty as a tropical, mega-diverse country. And the UK is very keen to work further with Malaysia to strengthen environmental protection and sustainable development. Malaysia's pledge to retain 50% of forest cover is, of course, very well known, and it far outstrips, I have to say, the UK's own record, where just 13% of our land is woodland. We're making efforts to restore ecosystems at home and looking at our own supply chains to de-risk deforestation links. But it's also why we're working to support global conservation and the sustainable development of commodity products. So coming back to today's report, we very much hope that the report will serve as a helpful input into how we continue to work with Malaysia at all levels of society so that we work with nature to strengthen climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. To take just one current example, we have a programme called the UK Pact Programme, Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions, and this includes a project exploring frameworks for nature-based solutions in Terengganu. Questions of finance and scale are central, which is why part of our commission for this report addresses fiscal tools and mechanisms. At the same time, I should add a sort of health warning. This report has been independently conducted by RESCU, and neither its analysis nor conclusions necessarily represent UK policy. It's an effort to strengthen the research evidence and knowledge base, both for ourselves, but also for the wider community of stakeholders, which is why we'll be very interested in the comments, reactions, and analysis that you, the audience, will have for us. Finally, all that remains is me to thank RESCU for their work on this study, and we very much look forward to their presentation and the discussion which follows. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your opening remarks. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the leader of the study team and managing director of RESCU, Dr. Teckwyn Lim. Dr. Lim has over 20 years of expertise in forestry and has worked with multiple agencies, including government agencies, the private sector, and civil societies in environmental laws and forestry matters. I'd like to welcome him to present the study today. The floor is yours, Dr. Lim.
Right, thank you, Divya, and welcome everyone. So we've got quite a lot of material to get through, but if you bear with me, I've divided it up into 2 sessions, like Divya mentioned. And so they're each about 30 minutes, and I'm confident we'll be able to get through it. Right, to start off with, the introduction to the project has already been more or less given by His Excellency, the High Commissioner. And the proviso as well that it was commissioned by the South Asia Research Hub, which is based in India, and also had the support of the High Commission in Kuala Lumpur. The outline, as Divya has mentioned, includes these 2 sessions. And the first one, which I'm going to jump right into, is talking about Malaysia's green pledges and the land categories that we have here in Malaysia. So what are these green pledges? Well, I'm sure you've heard of some of them before, but the top 5, or the ones I just pulled out and selected as the ones that are most prominent and relevant today, are number 1, to ensure net zero by 2050. And that coincides, of course, with the Sustainable Development Goal number 13 on climate action. And also, this is really quite ambitious, but a commitment to protect 20% of our land area by 2050. And that fits in with another Sustainable Development Goal, life on land. And this is going to be the focus of the talk today, is to maintain 50% of our land under forest cover. And then we also have several other prominent pledges that have been made in recent years, and that's including a pledge to stop all forest conversion for palm oil, and also a pledge to recognize indigenous land rights. And then, unfortunately, due to time constraints, I won't be able to address all of these issues in that much detail. So please read the full report, which touches on some of these other issues, such as the indigenous rights. Now, the first thing that we did in the study is that we assessed these pledges, and we wanted to see how, Malaysia made the promise, how far have we come in terms of implementing the promise. And in order to do that, it seems that we've got several steps in order to get to action at the end. So we have a pledge, and then we turn the pledge ideally into policy, a written policy document, and then have a plan to implement pledge and procedures in the nuts and bolts of how we're going to implement the plan. And then eventually we have practice. Now, For each of these 5 pledges, the policy is generally quite good, although there's a gap in the indigenous lands right policy, and that there's some benefits, but there have been some progress, but there's also been some backsliding. But generally speaking, the policies, plans, and procedures have all been going in the right direction, and that is clearly improving. You know, we're actually quite good at producing nice, shiny documents saying exactly what we will do. But unfortunately, when it comes to implementation, there have been some challenges, and the challenges include net zero, in that you know, we really need to reverse the trajectory there, both in terms of carbon emissions, but also carbon sequestration. And that is how both the protection and the forest cover come into play. And so the forest cover is key to ensuring that the forests sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and therefore we can meet this target. But yeah, unfortunately, there the trend has been negative, and so this is what I'm going to focus on, because it's related to net zero. The forest cover question is related to net zero. All right. So what is our forest cover pledge? That goes back to 1992 in the Rio Earth Summit, when Dr. M, in his first incarnation, came out with a very clear statement, which was to ensure that at least 50% of our land area will remain permanently under forest cover. And Dr. M repeated that pledge when in his second stint as Prime Minister in 2019 at the United Nations General Assembly. And similarly, the current government, the current Minister for Environment, Tuan Ibrahim, at the recent Glasgow summit, repeated, he said, we are committed to maintaining at least 50% forest cover, as was pledged during the Rio Earth Summit. So quite clear commitment. However, when it comes to the black and white of the policy, we came up with a nice, shiny forestry policy, Malaysia's first Malaysia-level forest policy last year. And the fine print, unfortunately, introduces a degree of ambiguity in our pledge. The Malays here, the Malaysia committed untuk terus mengekalkan sekurang-kurangnya 50% daripada keluasan tanah negara sebagai hutan dan litupan pokok. And I'd like to stress the dan litupan pokok, because that's a new addition in terms of it adds a new term. You know, forest is quite clear, but what is tree cover? And so the commitment is forest plus tree cover is 50% of land area. So that is something that we all need to look at. And so there is an international definition of tree cover and forest, and that's defined by a document produced by the United Nations FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization. And they have this global assessment of the forests around the world. And in that assessment, they come up with a definition for forests and various forest categories, including this category, which is known as other land with tree cover. So you've got these 3 green boxes, which are our Wordle objective. We definitely want green, and under the FAO definition, plantation forests, naturally regenerating forests, and also virgin primary forests are all forest. So forest is relatively clear, but then there's a boundary, or the slight gray area when it comes to other land with tree cover. Now, in Malaysia, of course, the important other trees, apart from forest trees, are oil palm trees and rubber trees. And so are oil palm plantations considered forest? Well, the FAO, Global Forest Resource Assessment, the UN, says clearly no. If the objective is agriculture, and they explicitly give the example of oil palm producing crops such as palm oil, if that is the objective of the land use zoning of a particular area, then that area cannot be considered forest, and the land is considered tree cover, other land with tree cover. Now, for rubber, it's actually rather confusing, because if the rubber plantation is a timber latex clone, that's a type of rubber tree that grows quickly, so it produces a lot of timber quickly. Not only does it produce latex, but it also produces timber. If the plantation is that type of rubber tree, then, and if the land where the rubber trees are growing is zoned for forest, such as it's inside a forest reserve, then yes, the rubber plantation can be considered forest. It's considered a plantation forest. However, if the rubber plantation is mainly about producing latex, and if the rubber plantation is on private land zoned for agriculture, then it is considered this other land with tree cover. It is not considered forest. So this is really quite an arbitrary definition, and it's based on legality rather than, I mean, the trees themselves could be identical, but it depends on the zoning of the land, whether or not it can be fit within a forest or not. But you can see the issue here in that we've got we've got a pledge for forest and a pledge for tree cover. And let's see how that pans out in practice. So Malaysia is still a very green country. And you can say this is according to the official statistics, we are keeping our pledge in that we have 18.2 million hectares, gone down a bit. This is 2016 statistics. But it's still more than 50% of our national land area under forest cover. And the dark green are the totally protected areas, the light green are the production forests, the forest reserve areas on this map. Now, in terms of the statistics, the figures, we have here a table which kind of spells it out. In that, let's start at the bottom, the totally protected areas, which include things like our Taman Negara, our wildlife sanctuaries, state park forests, and other protection forests, including areas that have been gazetted as virgin jungle reserves. And there are many different classifications depending on whether you're in Sabah, Sarawak, or Peninsular Malaysia. And but yeah, we are on the way to our 20% target, and that we're more than 10%. And this is actually quite, this is based on the National Protected Areas Master List, which was quite a few, it's about 4 years ago. And since then, this area has increased. So this is an encouraging trend in terms of protected areas. Then we also have production forest, and these are areas that are zoned as forest reserves, but for production, for timber production, meaning that it must be for trees, but the trees can be logged, but they must be logged according to the principles of sustained yield, which is a subset of what's known internationally as sustainable forest management. And this is more the Malaysia terminology, but we refer to the production forest together with the protected areas as permanent forest, sometimes known as permanent forest estate, but generally permanent forest, meaning that it is forest that at the moment at least is planned to be kept under forest cover. So you've got permanent forest. However, we still have an area of forest that's known as state land forest, which is not so permanent. In fact, it is it has no special protection. The states can alienate it, meaning the states can give it out as private land for development. And so it's in a way, it's a kind of a land bank. And we still have about 10% of our land area under this category here, which is a bit shaky in the sense that it's not permanent forest, and therefore it could be turned into another land use. So you see, even though our pledge is being met, if nothing is done, then and this forest is developed, then we're going to be in trouble, because we're going to drop below the 50%. Right, and then we come to the other land with tree cover, which, as we found earlier, includes rubber and oil palm plantations, and also trees in the city, like an avenue of trees along the road. All of that comes into the other land with tree cover. But taken together, it's still a very green country. You know, more than 2/3 of Malaysia have forest and tree cover. So that gets to the question of our national forest policy and what does it mean? So if we start off, say today, with 60% forest and 20% other land with tree cover, then we have 80% forest and tree cover. So we've got nothing to worry about. The danger, however, is that, you know, if we start to drop, our forest pledge is not met if we drop below 50% forest, but the 20% other land with tree cover means we still meet the forestry policy. And similarly, in worst case scenario, which is not going to happen, but I'm going to put it out here anyway, in that to reduce the thing to its extreme, in that you could have a tiny patch of forest and 60% of the land under, say, oil palm or rubber, or I don't know, you know, pokok pisang, which is a banana tree in your garden. I don't know, but then we would still be able to claim, oh yeah, 60% of Malaysia is under forest and tree cover. So that's why the policy is rather shaky, despite the fact that the pledge is strong. Now, it's not all gloom and doom, because all right, this a bit complicated figure for our administration, but it's important to highlight this complexity, because in order to make a consistent national policy on forests, you need to look at not only the federal government, federal forestry department, federal ministry. You also need to look at what the policy is in Sabah, which has Sabah and Sarawak, which have completely independent forestry departments, plus all of the states of Peninsular Malaysia, which I haven't shown them all here, but the reality is that it is complex. Anyhow, what happened was that national, I'll just jump back, this national forest policy was approved by, who approved it? Well, it was approved by the picture is the Prime Minister, and approved by the federal cabinet, but also approved, and this is important, also approved by the National Land Council. And the National Land Council includes the governor, well, no, not the governor, the chief minister of Sabah and Sarawak, and all the Menteri Besar and chief ministers of Peninsular Malaysia. And so they all endorsed that 50% forest and tree cover pledge. But I guess it was too difficult to get them to commit to the 50% outright 50% forest cover. But nevertheless, we have something else fairly interesting here. We have something called the National Physical Planning Council. And that also includes representatives from the federal cabinet and also the states of Peninsular Malaysia. Even though it's called national, its main scope is Peninsular Malaysia. Although it also looks after Labuan, but Sabah and Sarawak are not underneath the scope. But nevertheless, it's an important body, and it allowed the creation of another important planning document called the National Physical Plan, Rancangan Fisikal Negara, which is now in its 4th iteration. And it actually, and again, it came out just last year, this latest National Physical Plan, but it actually came up with the plan for 50% forest cover. And so it's despite the fact that the forest policy is kind of watered down by this tree, the land with tree cover. No, this document has committed, or not only committed, it says, all right, here's the plan. Here is how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to get 50% overall in Malaysia. And what it commits to, or what it plans, is between the reference year was 2019, but between 2019 and 2040, Peninsular Malaysia forest is going to go from 43.5% to 50%. So there's going to be, like, the state land's going to be locked up as forest. Maybe some of the private land will be taken back, and the forest reserves will be expanded. And then we'll be able to get 50% for Peninsular Malaysia. And the assumption at the same time is that Sabah and Sarawak will have frozen their forests according to the 2019 reference year. And therefore, the total forests in Malaysia will be 57.7% of our land area. So that has been approved by the Cabinet and by the National Physical Planning Council. So very ambitious, but there are some questions, of course, in that. Well, number one, did Sabah and Sarawak agree? Because they're not. I don't think they were in the meeting that approved it. Did they agree to freeze their land? Well, actually, since 2019, the forest area in both Sabah and Sarawak has dropped. So maybe no one passed them the memo. And in Peninsular Malaysia as well, since 2019, it has dropped. So we're not on target to meet this. Maybe it's because that even though this was a plan, the specifics, the details on how we're going to achieve this plan were not that clearly spelled out. And in particular, even the states of Peninsular Malaysia, the individual states of Peninsular Malaysia, even though they signed up to this pledge during the meeting, maybe they didn't. It seems that they don't have individual targets. So maybe, for example, Selangor is relying on Pahang to have 60%. It's not entirely clear. I did speak to many people during the study. We interviewed more than a dozen stakeholders, and we did not manage to get an answer to that question. What we did find out is that at least 2 states have got a commitment. And unfortunately, these were the only 2 states we could find. And the only state to have a commitment to forest cover, explicitly just forest cover, is Selangor. And Selangor is only committed to 30% of its land area. So if the only state that is committed to 30%, there's an issue. Sabah, I should mention, and they also have adopted the same language as the Malaysia forest policy, or very, very similar language. And they talk about, well, you can see it here, but 50% to be designated for sustainable forest use and tree cover for environmental protection, biodiversity conservation, and socioeconomic well-being. Now, does that tree cover for socioeconomic well-being, does that include rubber plantations? Does it include oil palm plantations? Unfortunately, the document is silent on that question. And there's no distinct pledge for forest, and there's no distinct pledge for tree cover. So that's okay. So that's basically it for the first session, which highlights some of the issues. And I'll be happy to I'll hand back to the MC, but I'll be, Divya, I'll be happy to take any questions on that kind of background, bearing in mind that the recommendations, the solutions, we'll go into more detail in the next session. So if the questions can be focused on these issues of how we are categorizing land in Malaysia, and this definition of forest and tree cover. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Teckwyn, for the first half of your presentation. We have a question from Sunita and Mei Fong, who are asking where they can get a copy of the study.
All right. Yeah, so we'll put a link. In fact, the link to a copy of the study is on the flyer, which was on the invitation. So if you have a look at the invitation, you should see the link to the report. But we'll share it in the chat as well.
Okay, we will share the link to the report in the chat shortly. Thank you, Sunita and Mei Fong. And Brahim Nick, I see your hand is raised. We will get to you right after this, okay? So Faiz PWC has a question written in the chat. Mr. Lim, why did we move the commitment from forest cover to forest and tree cover? And how do we deal with the conflict between the national plan and the commitment numbers? Also, are the state commitments enshrined in state law?
Yeah. All right, the very good question. So I will answer the first question. And why did we move from the commitment? Well, actually, we never made any commitment to forest cover. Our Prime Minister did. That's the difference, and Prime Minister, unfortunately, he cannot speak on behalf of the states when it comes to forest policy. So when he went to Rio and when he spoke in the General Assembly, and also when our Environment Minister went to Glasgow, he had no power to speak on behalf of the states to say there's a commitment to 50% forest cover. The states have only committed to forest and tree cover. And so we, as a federation, never adopted such a commitment to begin with. Our leaders, some of our individual leaders made the pledge, but we as a nation have never made that pledge. So there's no question of moving. It's just that, unfortunately, when the federal government tried to get the states to buy into the 50% pledge, there was reluctance from the states because naturally some of the states are, like Selangor, is already down to 30%. So Selangor would not want to sign up to something which it cannot achieve. All right, the second question, I think maybe it's best dealt with after the second section of the talk. How do we deal with the conflict? And then the third question, is the state commitments enshrined in state law? Very good question. The Selangor commitment is not enshrined in the law. It is just a commitment based on a decision of the State Executive Council. However, the law, as the audience might be aware, the law has recently been amended on the federal parliament last week, or was it earlier this week? Yeah, it was Monday, I think, passed an amendment to the National Forestry Act, which requires further safeguards, including public hearing for any excision. So the law is being tightened to prevent decline in forest area. So Selangor is already it's already more than 30% permanent forest. And so in a way you can say it's fairly safe. However, we'll get back to that question, how to make it safer in the second half of the talk. Okay.
And Veronica Yao asks, what about stopping forest conversion for other types of usage, such as logging, mining, etc.?
All right. Yeah, so why is there forest conversion to begin with? Yeah, mining is one reason that land is converted. Plantations are other reasons. There are many reasons for converting land. The logging per se is not really something that results in conversion. If the land is a permanent forest, it can be logged and it can even be clear felled, but its status as a forest is remains according to the international definition, also according to the Malaysian definition.
Okay. And the next one is from Rahim Nick, who will be asking you a question in person. Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay. Hello.
Hi, good afternoon.
All right. My name is Rahim Nick. I used to be a government officer in Putrajaya, but now I'm retired. So I have some I know some of the audience as well. All right. First, I want to know this report you have written quite comprehensively. To whom you have to address this report to? Whether you have to send this to Prime Minister office, or you have to send to EPU, or to specific ministry, because there are some valid question need to, but I think it's good that you can focus this to respective government agencies so that they can respond to all these things. Secondly, with regard to the pledge, you mentioned that 5 pledges, but the first pledge in 1992, when the former Prime Minister went there, I recall he said not only forest, but also tree cover already in that. You can check with whatever document before, already mentioned during that time that Malaysia want to ensure that we remain 50% forest and tree cover. So I think it's very clear. I know because I know I have a copy before of this commitment or pledge made by Dr. Mahathir. Then following that, there were similar pledges in Copenhagen 2009 when the previous Prime Minister made a speech, also mentioned this phrase. So then a question that we shift. You mentioned all along, but of course documentation wise maybe not clear, but you can check back all these things. Huh? Then thirdly, since you deal a lot with land matter, land law in Malaysia, you should address first that land matter is under the state purview, as mentioned in Schedule 9 of the Malaysian Constitution. Unless and until we change these clauses, not much federal or not much clout the federal can use. Because federal only deal with the research and advisory, but the state are empowered to make decision on land. So without any amendment to the constitution, maybe nothing much the federal government can do, as you mentioned in all your report later on. Okay, so that's so much now. I have a few other when you go to it.
Okay, all right, Dr. Rahim, it's always good to hear from you, and we value your inputs, given the fact that you have been working on these issues since long before that I was involved. Your third question, I will respond to maybe after the second session. The first question is interesting though, because you are right. When Dr. Mahathir went to Rio, he did use the term forest and tree cover. But before that, in the run-up to Rio, there was a preparatory meeting where he first mentioned this 50% pledge, and it was in Crystal Crown Hotel in Kuala Lumpur, and he came out. It was widely reported, and also the text of the speech is very clear. It says 50% forest cover without the and tree cover added. And similarly, in 2019, in the United Nations General Assembly, Dr. Mahathir repeated, and again very explicitly, 50% forest cover, and also mentioning that there will be no further clearance of forest for palm oil. So I don't know whether it's intentional, but there is a lot of confusion on this. For example, the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, when he opened Parliament recently, he also used the term 50% forest dan liputi pokok. But the media just reported 50% forest. They did not mention the and tree cover issue. So that is confusing. And your first question before that, who is this report targeted to? Who will it be presented to? Now, As we mentioned at the start, the report was commissioned by the UK High Commission, and we will be having further meetings with them to determine the advocacy strategy that they're going to use in the next step. How are they going to submit it to the federal government? Are they going to be submitting it to the state governments? All of that is ultimately going to be up to the UK High Commission, and we will be holding further meetings with them to discuss the next strategy. But yeah, definitely we'll need to take into account your point about the federal government jurisdiction being very limited. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question is from Amin Majid, who's asking, how are countries made accountable for the pledges? Are they?
Yeah, it's also a good question. So there's this term called ratification or rectification. So individual politicians can go about saying whatever they like, but until and unless the relevant authority, whether it be the Legislative Assembly, Parliament, or the state assemblies, adopt those pledges and turn them into law, then the accountability is really only through the ballot box. You can only hold them accountable through the ballot box.
And the next question is from Yo Hua Law. It's interesting and encouraging to see that the NPP4 aims for 50% forest cover in peninsular Malaysia. Skepticism is warranted. How come we never see that target mentioned by politicians?
Thanks, Yahua, for the question. I would say that actually we hear it a lot. The target is mentioned a lot. It was mentioned. Yeah, it's mentioned constantly at the federal level that we're committed, especially in the context of palm oil and timber. Whenever there's any questions about the sustainability of our production, the pledge, 50% forest cover pledge is mentioned, but that's on the national level. It's a valid point that this 50% for cover for Peninsular Malaysia that's mentioned in the National Physical Plan number 4, that one, I don't think that has been reported on by the press, and I don't recall any politicians mentioning the 50% for Peninsula before.
Okay, thank you. And the last one is from Melvin Lam. Has Pahang government made any commitments?
All right, yeah, that's a good question. So look, the Pahang is the most important state in terms of forests in Peninsular Malaysia. It's the largest state in Peninsular Malaysia. And it has also come under a lot of pressure in terms of how it's managing the forests, its forests. I am not aware of any explicit statement committing to a certain percentage. However, the Pahang government does have something called the Pahang State Structure Plan. And that plan has a lot of maps in it. It maps the area of forest. And it is that plan can be seen as a commitment to maintaining a certain area under tree cover for the duration of the plan. I think these plans are often, I think the structure plan is for 10 years or 15 years, but they are official state documents that have a spatial plan for the state. And so in a way that is a commitment, but if that answers the question. Okay.
Thank you, Teckwyn. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Okay, I think that's it for now.
All right, great. Thank you, Divya, and excellent timing. We are on track. And thank you everyone for the questions, all very relevant. All right, so next session we're going to be talking about the drivers in a bit more detail, like what is actually happening on a state level that causes this forest to be excised, and when we understand the drivers, then we can think about how we can address them. So before we go into the drivers, we just to recap that on a state level, you have normally one person who is in charge of the final say on whether a land becomes a forest reserve or not, forest reserve, and that's Menteri Besar. Of course, he's acting as in his capacity as the chairman of the standing committee in charge of natural resources and land. And this is just an example from Selangor, and I'm not sure if it's still correct, but it's quite common in most of the states in Peninsular Malaysia for the Menteri Besar to chair the state land committee that makes this decision, and that oversees the forestry department. Also, importantly, it oversees the Department of Land and Mines, and also reports to the State Executive Council. So if we think in terms of the Menteri Besar, and similarly in Sabah and Sarawak, the chief minister as normally the decision maker and on deciding whether land is forested or not. Then, and I apologize, this model is slightly confusing, but we'll break it down. But so if we think here we've got the we say the Menteri Besar is here sitting in the middle of this big model of decision making in the state. And so the Menteri Besar has a lot of different pressures on him. It's normally him. I think it's always been him. On whether or not to reserve a forest and reserve an area of land, or to excise it. And so the factors include things like public opinion, the financial position of the state, whether there have been any commitments, whether the state is bound by any of these green pledges, and also, unfortunately, there are other pressures, and these are the pressures to remove an area of forest. These include pressures such as applications for land. And you'll hear about the term corruption, but this is a special type of corruption which occurs when the powers that be, or the developers, or other interests, economic interests, have control over the decision maker, and that is known as elite capture. It means that the decision maker basically is powerless, or he's in the pocket of more powerful interests who have control over him, and that. Then he will say, oh, my hands are tied, or he might not even say it. He probably won't say it, but his hands are then tied, and then he would have no choice, more or less no choice, but to excise the land. And so there are several things which are influencing the degree of elite capture in the state. And those include whether or not the integrity enforcement agencies are doing their job, and whether or not there is transparency and accountability over the decisions of whether or not an area remains as forest or is excised, and whether or not the public can see what's going on. That's where these public hearings are so important. So it's great that they increase transparency and accountability. And the dashed line means has a negative effect on. So if you increase transparency and accountability, that actually reduces elite capture. And so that's a good thing. And what we are recommending in our report is focusing on these 3 points, which have got the green dot on them. And we are suggesting increasing legislative oversight, and I will explain this in more detail, to increase the transparency and accountability, and also increase things like the media coverage of forest issues, including what are known as excisions or degazettements of forests. And the other thing we're going to be looking at are payments for ecosystem services and something known as ecological fiscal transfer, which in theory will increase the income to the state. And then when the income to the state increases, that again, in theory, will improve the financial position of the state, and ultimately result in the politician being more willing to protect the forest. And finally, we'll talk about something known as debt for nature swap, which won't actually increase the income to the state, but will improve the financial position of the state. And so all of these things aimed to influence the Menteri Besar in a positive way, to get him to agree to reserve more areas and excise fewer areas. I won't go into all of these drivers, just to mention that ultimately everything comes back to population growth, and you have demand for commodities, demand for development, which is more or less a given. And so this is the scenario we live in. The question more is how can, maybe we can influence population growth to a certain extent, but it's hardly something that we can in the short term. But we can influence things more readily in the short term by focusing on these three aspects, which I will explain in more detail during this presentation. All right, the first thing is increasing legislative oversight. And oversight generally is what I mentioned earlier when we're talking about these public hearings. And so the decision, we said earlier, right, that the decision to excise is made by the Menteri Besar. And in most states in Malaysia, it's still it's done kind of quietly, and only after the fact it is published in the Gazette. But in a couple of states, Sabah and Selangor, there's a requirement for some more transparency before the fact. And in Selangor, they have these public hearings. And as I mentioned, the National Forestry Act, just on Monday, it's been amended. And so hopefully the state governments in Peninsular Malaysia will all adopt that amendment, which will allow for the public to have some say on the decision on whether or not to excise a forest. Now, Sabah is an interesting case. We go over to Sabah. Sabah's over here. So in Sabah, the chief minister doesn't have that power. Not even the cabinet, the state cabinet does not have the power over the forests. The forest, any amendments in the forest reserves, whether they want to take areas out or add areas in, that needs to go back to the state assembly. They have something called the Sabah Forest Reserves Enactment, which means that there's an extra layer of people watching, eyes looking, and well, of course, when it goes to the state assembly, you have the wakil rakyat, the representatives of the people, and so the public, in a way, have a say through their representative. In that the representative can vote against any plan to remove an area of forest. So this is actually quite a good model, and something similar could be adopted in Sarawak and in Peninsular Malaysia as well. Although because the law in Peninsular Malaysia doesn't really follow the Sabah model, we'd have to come up with a slightly different way of doing it. But do we really need it though? If we have a public hearing, is it good enough? And unfortunately, you see several cases recently in Selangor. There was a public hearing for the Kuala Langat Utara Forest Reserve. And despite the fact that there were thousands of people who objected, and most of the agencies they didn't really think it was a good idea. And despite the fact that the National Physical Plan says it should be forested, despite the fact that the Selangor State Structure Plan says that the area should be forested, despite the fact that there was, no EIA done, and despite, and this is the kicker really, despite the fact that the Selangor State Legislative Assembly passed a resolution to say we should save the forests, the Menteri Besar and the EXCO still went ahead and excised the forest reserve. Most of it, like 99% of it, they completely disregarded all of that, and they said that the decision of the State Assembly was non-binding. It was just an advice, despite the fact it was a unanimous decision by the Assembly to save this particular forest reserve. They still went ahead, and so it shows that the requirement for public hearing is not really strong enough. And so what can be done to maybe follow the Sabah model to empower the State Assembly? So if the State Assembly says, save the forest, then the Menteri Besar and the EXCO will have no choice but to save the forest. So how do we do that? Well, together with our legal team, we had to look at the National Forestry Act, and it's quite a minor amendment can be made that requires that the State Assembly has a say, or it requires approval. And so this is the technical amendment, but basically it's an amendment of Section 13 of it's the National Forestry Act, basically, but it's the Selangor Adoption Enactment, which says that before any before any excision notification is published, then it must, a draft of the notification must be laid before the Legislative Assembly and approved by a resolution of the Legislative Assembly. So that basically means if you want to excise an area of forest, you can still do it, but you need to go through the Assembly. If you're a Menteri Besar and you want to excise Kuala Langat Utara, you just make a motion to the Assembly, say we move that we are going to excise this forest, and you just put that before the Assembly. And if the Assembly approves it, then you can go ahead. But if the Assembly does not approve it, then you can't. So there's one way to address the valid point that Dr. Rahim made earlier, in that there will need to be, the state has the final say on these forests. And if it's like the federal government can say what it likes, but unless the state actually adopts something along these lines, then the forests are still going to be shaky, in a shaky position. All right. So why would a state willingly tie its hands along these lines? I mean, the states, you could imagine they would be fighting tooth and nail, because the forest revenue is actually quite important for several of the states, especially the poorer states with larger land area, such as Pahang was mentioned earlier, but also Kelantan and Terengganu. So why would they give up their rights in such a way? Well, maybe it's not giving up the right, but the Menteri Besar at the moment is very powerful because he has the control of these forests. Why would he give something like this up? And why would the states agree to give some? I think the States Assembly themselves would have no problem with it, but politically it might be difficult unless there's some carrot thrown into the mix. And so I've stolen this slide from ERE Consulting, but it demonstrates really in a compelling way that the federal revenue is huge. You've got over 200 billion ringgit compared to all of the states combined. They barely 20 billion in terms of their annual revenue. So And of that 20 billion, some of the states, such as I mentioned, like Pahang and Kelantan, a lot of that revenue comes from forests. And so if they were to, and from land development, so if they were to agree to protection or even more forest reserves, then they are foregoing some potential revenue. They're giving it up, you know, and so there will be a shortfall unless some of this money is channeled back to the states to compensate them. And so that's where this thing called ecological fiscal transfer comes in. And it was first in Malaysia. I'm really positive about this, although as we'll see later, there are certain issues, right? It first came in the 2019 budget when 60 million ringgit was allocated for the purposes to help fund specific projects by the state government to protect and expand our existing natural reserves. And I should emphasize this protect and expand in that it's a great idea, but the mechanism still hasn't really been ironed out. And even though an additional 70 million was allocated in 2021 and in 2022, it was announced that 130 million had been dispersed. There's still an issue as to did this really result in any additional protection or any expansion of nature reserves? Was there really any expansion? I mean, the expansion implies not only new protected areas, but no net loss, meaning that maybe they excise some areas, but overall the total area of protection was increased. And so did that happen? And it doesn't seem that it did. And there was nothing really binding on the states when this money was spent or dispersed to them. There was no clear area-based target, and that's a shortfall. And unfortunately, it seems that this, even though it's a really great thing that the 70 million in this year's budget, the commitment has been made to make it a permanent feature of the budget. It seems that it's about reimbursing expenses on conservation criteria that's more general. For example, it's about upkeeping protected areas, existing protected areas, managing them, which is valid and good, but it's not really addressing this core issue of expansion of reserves, which if we're going to achieve the 50% target for Peninsular Malaysia, we need to expand the area of forest reserves. And even though I see this EFT as the main candidate mechanism in order to achieve that, at the moment it kind of falls short, because as I'll explain later, this 70 million is nowhere near enough to compensate the revenue forgone by the states if they were to give up land for protection. All right. So what mechanisms could there be? And so there are several, and you need to start off with proper evaluation of ecosystem services, and you'd need to make the payment to the states hinge on an actual quantified assessment of the ecosystem services. And that can be done on the basis of any kind of ecosystem service. And you will no doubt have heard about, I mentioned earlier, the carbon sequestration, but there are other ecosystem services such as water. And then this is an example, biodiversity offsets, which are used in other states. And I won't go into this in any detail, just to let you all know that there are mechanisms, very tried and tested mechanisms around the world for evaluating what it is you actually want to save and quantify how much is actually being saved, and tying it in with the recommendations, or tying it in with the payment. All right. So this is some just rough calculation. I said 70 million is not enough, and so how do I get that? So if we look at the table from the National Physical Plan, and then we want to target an increase of in permanent forests in Sarawak, we're talking about 3 million hectares increase, and then slightly less for Peninsular Malaysia and Sabah. But overall, we're talking about 5 million hectares of additional permanent forest in order to meet the NPP for the National Physical Plan target of 57.7. So yeah, this is an awful lot, and unfortunately, National Physical Plan doesn't put a ringgit value, and we haven't done a detailed economic valuation for this, but we can use just as a kind of a back of the envelope calculation based on some numbers that have been used in, there was a case in Terengganu where they used 350 ringgit per year for use rate for a 1,000 square meter area of forest. And so I'm not sure whether this is appropriate. It might be too high, and maybe the states might say it's too low. But just as an indication, you can see that we're talking about a total of around 17 billion ringgit compared to 70 million ringgit in terms of the potential annual cost. And then we might not want to make it an annualized solution. We might be a more clear cut if we make a one-off payment, and then based on that once-off payment from the federal government, then the states will be committed. But even if it is an annualized basis, how much is 17 billion? Well, if you compare it to the total federal revenue, it's a fraction of the total federal revenue, but it is a significant portion when you consider the existing state revenue. So these figures would definitely be attractive enough for the states to agree to. I'm thinking it would be enough to get them to agree to commit an increase. Of course, the mechanism would require more work and more consultation with the states, but something along these lines would be what would be needed. All right, and final thing, before we open up to the second round of Q&A, is the idea of a debt for nature swap. So we go back, and this is also a fiscal mechanism, but it doesn't increase income to the state. It reduces the liabilities of the state. So at the moment, the state governments owe about 35 billion ringgit to the federal government. This is mostly for water infrastructure. And so the solution could be that the federal government could agree to some kind of plan whereby they write off part of the state government's debt in exchange for the state government committing to increasing the area under conservation or under forest reserve. And it's certainly, there are certainly many precedents for the federal government writing off state debt, and to quite a significant amount. And then you talk about, you can have a look. Last year, the federal government wrote off this almost 700 million ringgit of debt that the Kedah government owed. And again, this was mostly for water infrastructure. And they had some kind of agreement related to the water assets of the state in exchange for this. But another example, this is a federal government writing off debt. It's not, in this example, it's not really to the state, but it's to Felder settlers. And there was a similar example of settlers in the state of Kelantan being given a debt write-off. And in these cases, it's not entirely clear what the federal government gained from writing off this debt, but it would certainly be possible to put in place some kind of binding commitment. In exchange for writing off the debt, the state could commit to increasing the area of forest cover. All right. Before I go on, I'll just go back to ecological fiscal transfer. And I do want to mention that there is also a mechanism in the federal constitution for the federal government to allocate money. And so this money is, I don't have the slide here, but in the report, I mentioned how the federal government does pay the states every year. And there are certain acts that have been drafted that say the payments from the federal to the state can be contingent on meeting certain criteria. And so there is such an act that could be created for ecological fiscal transfer. All right, so that's basically it. And just to recap the recommendations, that it'd be good if the states commit to, the individual states commit to forest target. And maybe also, it would be good like if they also have a protected area target. As far as I know, the only state with the protected area target is Sabah again, and they commit to, I think it's 20%. So yeah, each state should have a protected area target, a forest target, and also maybe a tree cover target, because the tree cover is good as well. You know, it's not that tree cover has no value. So they can have those kind of targets. And if you wanted to make it even more from an ecological perspective, you could also come up with targets for natural forest. But this study didn't really look at that in so much detail. But yeah, state commitments is absolutely necessary. And in exchange for the state commitments, then there could be some kind of ecological fiscal transfer or debt for nature swap. And yeah, I'm jumping around a bit, but yeah, the other recommendation was this need to increase the legislative oversight, meaning making sure that not only is the public informed, but also the state assembly, the individual members of the Wakil Rakyat, the Ahli Dewan Undangan Negeri, the, what do you call them, members of the state legislative assembly, all have a say when decisions are made affecting our natural heritage. Okay, so on that note, I will end slightly early, but to allow for the Q&A. So Divya, maybe if I could go back to those questions from the first round, which I didn't answer.
Yeah, of course. Do you want me to read them out, or do you want to?
Yeah, yeah. If you can find, I'm not sure if I could find. There was, I know there was one from Dr. Rahim, but there was also one before that I said I would answer. Okay, let's see. All right, yeah, I see from Faiz from Pricewaterhouse. Yes. Okay, how do we deal with the conflict between the national plan and the commitment numbers? Yeah, so I hope that has been addressed by the recommendations. I think this is the way forward that we need to, and the federal government needs to come up with a mechanism to implement this plan, and ecological fiscal transfer and debt for nature swap would be the two obvious mechanisms. Okay.
Okay.
And Dr. Rahim's, just trying to remember his, was it his third comment, which his third comment was regarding the legality, which I think I hopefully have addressed as well, that, yeah, even though it's absolutely true that the states have power over the forest, I think I would disagree with Dr. Rahim in that it's not right to say that there's nothing the federal government can do, because if you look here, you see how powerful the federal government is. So there's a lot of carrots that the federal government has at its disposal. And I think we just have to be creative. It's not easy, but it's definitely within the realms of what is possible. Plus, I would say that, and this is where getting into politics, but there are political channels that the federal government can and did use. And I should be fair to Selangor, because yeah, I gave them a hard time for the Kuala Lumpur Utara without mentioning that in the end, it seems that there was some federal political influence, pressure applied, and the Menteri Besar agreed to reverse the excision, although I don't think it's happened yet, which I'm not sure why, but they've been taking their time to reverse it. So very quick to excise, very slow to re-gazette or reconstitute. But yeah, I mentioned that as an example of how political decision makers at the federal level through the political party can influence the state government's decision. And that has happened previously, not just the Kuala Lumpur Utara, but there's a famous example in Kedah, where the state of Kedah was planning to log Ulu Muda, and then the federal government, federal cabinet made a decision that they didn't think it was a good idea. And because Kedah at that time was under the same party as the prime minister, the Menteri Besar of Kedah agreed to go along with the prime minister, the cabinet decision. I think there was some money promised as a carrot, but I'm not sure really how that panned out. Maybe if we do have some time for discussion, so maybe some more knowledgeable people like Mr. Surin or others can comment on that later. But yeah, I think those were the two questions that hung over from the first Q&A. So with that, maybe we can go on to the fresh questions.
Okay, so I have Dr. Rahim over here who would like to make a few comments and also has his hand raised. So Dr. Rahim, you can make your comments now or ask any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you, Teckwyn, for your interesting suggestion and proposal to the government and states. Okay, first regarding EFT, ecological transfer, I think this is a good move by the federal government to initiate this. But I thought this 70 million is not enough. Maybe your report should aim for higher target. I agree with you that the federal government gets so much, 10 times more than state. And I've been working some state. In fact, some state don't have much money for conservation or protection. Therefore, this EFT should be increased over the years. Now 70 could be up to 200 million also, So we have to go for this so that the state has something to do to carry out whatever the federal has suggestion. All right, that's one. Secondly, on this, in your conclusion on the net zero target, I'm not sure you mentioned that before. But I agree that's a very important target for Malaysia as in other countries, to achieve net zero by 2050. You mentioned in the conclusion that you are worried about the emission from LULUCF, land use change, land use from forestry. But in fact, I know from where you're coming from, but you mentioned that all along, the emission from the energy and transportation has been increased, has been too high, which constitute about 77% of the total emission of the nation. So even though the LULUCF registered 17 million, but it's still very about 5% compared to 77% of the energy and transport. Therefore, I think you should mention that. If we were to achieve net zero target in future, we have to handle the energy and transport, and also, of course, LULUCF as well. And thirdly, on this suggestion to have 50% target of forest for all the state, I think with due respect to some state, maybe very, very difficult for them to achieve. For example, you take Malacca, some Kuala Lumpur. So to have a blanket statement that 50% should be increased for state, maybe we should put more creative way to those that have the means, the resources the land area for them to increase the forest area. And fourthly, I would suggest to you, you talk about the acquisition services. See, we know that the forest cover in the country serve a lot to sequester carbon emission. Maybe you can suggest to the federal government to have this incentive. We can call it carbon storage incentive, where they allocate some money for the state who continue to administer or to sequester carbon. So this part of the carrot to the state to do more to the forest, in addition to EFT. So all these things we have to get to channel more money from federal to the state. So this part of the acquisition services provided by the state in order for the nation to achieve the net zero target in future. I think, and then lastly, maybe you can put also in recommendation that we should have a comprehensive registry of forestry, land use, protection area, land conversion in one single platform, either EPU or whatever. But at the moment, you have to search for those data. You have to go around all the ministries. Sometimes they are not updated and difficult to get data from Sabah Sarawak. I know that very difficult to get those data. So now we put a recommendation that the federal government need to have established this registry to contain all this land-based data for us to see and also to monitor the achievement over the years. Okay, thank you very much, Teckwyn. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Rahim. I've taken note of all of those recommendations, and we can include them in the discussions with the UK High Commission for the report, for the advocacy of the report. I would just like to mention your last point on the central registry, and I absolutely agree. So in order for any of this EFT or anything to actually be implemented, the federal government and the state would have to agree on what it is that's being protected and conserved, and some central registry is really important. There was a publication which I refer to as the Protected Area Master List, and that was just about protected areas. Unfortunately, I think that the federal government withdrew that from publication. They are still working on revising it, and they plan to publish it. But it needs to not just be a static list, because the gazettes are being published every week. And so it needs to be a dynamic database, like you say, in order to capture in order to capture all of the latest data. But yeah, a really important suggestion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rahim. And the next question is from Mei Fong. Are there any country examples of successful or effective ETF implementation?
Yeah, right. So in the report, which has the link been shared already? I think has anyone shared it? Okay, someone shared Divya, you actually shared the report itself, but there should be a link as well, which we can share shortly. In the report, it does mention example from the Seychelles, where the government had agreed. They don't call it debt for nature swap. They call it a climate for nature swap. So that's one encouraging example, and that uses international finance rather than national finance. But that can be used as a model for the federal government and the state governments. In terms of the EFT, there are. Well, I gave two examples. One that Dr. Rahim mentioned as well is the carbon payment. And the other one is this payment for, well, it's known as biobanking. And it's similar to carbon credit system, but it's talking about biodiversity credits. And it's slightly more complicated, but it could be used together with carbon, and it could be used together with a payment for protection of water catchment areas. So all of these could be incorporated into the EFT. And there are many examples of carbon trading around the world. And there are also examples of biobanking around the world. Examples include in Australia, there are several states in Australia have biobanking programs, and also parts of the United States have biobanking that's already in place. And so that the biobanking is more from the private sector driven, but a similar thing could be put in place on between the different states. As Dr. Rahim mentioned, there will be a case, for example, for a small state such as Malacca or Federal Territory, that they could offset the fact that they are below 50% by paying a state that is above 50%. So you kind of have a mechanism where the rich and the financially rich but forest poor states pay the financially poor but forest rich states to keep their forest. Okay.
Okay, and the next question is from Surin. One potential federal incentive for states to conserve forests that has often been overlooked is to amend the Constitution so that amount of development grants from the federal to state are based on areas of forest protected. Currently, the development grants are dispersed based on the population of the state and the length of roads in each state. What do you think about the feasibility of this approach?
Yeah, so I've got two things to say there. One is that, yeah, the safest legislation, or the strongest legislation in terms of protecting the forests would be to amend the Constitution. And there are certain countries around the world which, in fact, Surin flagged to me recently, have incorporated the forest cover targets inside their Constitution, actually saying how much of their land will be forested as part of their Constitution. And in Malaysia, in addition to the federal Constitution, each state has its own constitution, and that could be done as well. There could be mention inside the Constitution about the forest protection, but that's not Surin's point. Surin's point is slightly different in that there's a mechanism that is mentioned in the Constitution, but actually the Constitution does not spell out that it's based on the number of population or on the number of roads. It's actually in an act. And in the report, we mentioned the act. There is an existing act which uses the more general provisions of the Constitution and says, okay, we're going to be making this payment based on the number of people in the state. But there is, as I mentioned, there is possibility for Parliament not to amend the Constitution, but to pass a new act that will say that will create a new stream of payments based on, for example, the amount of protected area in the state. So that could be done, and it definitely should be. I think that anyone interested in this should explore drafting such an act.
Okay, thank you for your question, Surin. The next question is by Yao. Nice exercise on counting how much of the EFT is necessary to get Peninsular Malaysia to 50% forest cover. I'd argue that RM 350 per hectare is on the low side. The state governments would be asking for EFT to compensate their losses of not converting the forests to agriculture or industry, etc., which commands a higher annual premium or rent than forest use of RM 350 per hectare. Would you agree?
I'm sorry.
Let me repeat that for you.
Yeah, can you just repeat that last bit? Yeah, okay. I can see it here. All
okay,
right.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. Okay. Yeah, 350 per hectare is an annualized. It was not 350 per hectare, was it? Let's just go back to that slide. Right. It was based on 350 per 1,000 square meters. So it's you have to times that by 10. So it's 3,500 per hectare. That was the basis that we used. And that's on an annualized basis. So I think it's in the ballpark. Yeah, so I'll I'm trying to do something else, but let me just share my screen again for that. Okay. Right, so yeah, you see it's 350 per 1,000 square meters, and so you have to times it by 10 to get the per hectare. All right.
Okay. And after that, it's by Faiz from PwC. Forget what states think. More forest cover equates to more carbon sequestration. What should our forest cover be, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, it depends on what basis you're saying. Hold on a second. I'm just sharing the link. Okay, so that's the link to the copy of the report if the download doesn't work. Okay, so I'm sorry, Divya. So this is by the question is from who?
Faiz.
Faiz. All right. Okay, I can see.
It's on the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, the two parts of that question, on the first part, of course, more forest equals more carbon. So from the point of view of the states, if you're just talking about carbon, the question is not so much how much carbon, but how much that will result in terms of ringgit, because the carbon itself doesn't really benefit the state directly. So I don't think it's about what my opinion should be on forest cover. I think the question is more how much forest carbon sequestration will result in funding that is attractive enough for the state governments to agree, okay, we keep it as forest. Okay.
Okay. And his next comment from Faiz as well. Our government operates under cash accounting currently. So what has been paid as expense, there is no real receivable from the states.
Yeah, fair point.
And also no real receivable in the federal books. So yes, more can be written off as there is no current cash flow impact. That's also from Faiz.
Yeah, that's an important point. Valid.
Okay, and the next question is from Kyrun. It's a two-part question. The EFT has been allocated in the budget for some years now, but federal government has yet to publish how states can draw this down, nor guidelines on what it can be used for. Will the suggested mechanism be sufficient without good governance?
Yeah, yeah, maybe I'll just answer that first. I see there's a second half, but I'll just answer that. So yeah, it's a kind of a leading question. Yeah, of course, it won't work without good governance. So if you look back at the model, if there's, let's see if I can show the model. Right. So if you look back at this model here, you'll see that if you have very poor enforcement of integrity, high levels of elite capture, then this line will be very strong. And similarly, if the land applications are only going to increase in terms of the price of the land is always increasing or has been tending to increase, and the shortage of state land is the availability of state land keeps going down. So these pressures are only going to keep increasing. And so integrity enforcement is absolutely key. And so if you're doing what sometimes is known as a problem tree and a logical framework analysis, then there are some assumptions that the things like payment, EFT and PS will only work if everything else remains equal. Because, you know, if integrity is not guaranteed, then these things are not going to work. Does that answer the question? That answers the point about integrity. But,
And there's a second part to the question. Okay.
Are you going to read it out?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I am. What is being allocated is far beyond what is needed to meet this target. How can this be addressed when there are competing pressures for budget allocations?
Yeah, all right. So this is a good question. So that's why we need both the carrot and the stick approach. And then, so it's not so much competing for the existing budget, but supplementing the existing budget with additional sources of income. And so that you could have all of these payment for ecosystem service solutions, including the biobanking and the carbon offset. They have the potential for creating additional funds. And this is something that the government is working on. It's not the topic of my report, but it's certainly things that the government is exploring.
Okay. And the next question is by Anonymous. Has the recommendations been communicated with KETSA and UPenn and to bring up to the National Land Council? How to ensure this is feasible in order to strengthen the political will and maintain the forest cover in Malaysia? If not, the issue will remain forever.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the actual strategy and presentation to the federal and state government has not yet been done. We have included in our consultees some representatives of the government, but the report has not been presented to them yet. But it's definitely the plan to do so, and the High Commission is going to be pursuing that.
Okay, and the next question is from Evelyn. What are your thoughts about the emerging carbon market where state could sell and earn revenues from carbon credits generated by their forests to corporations intending to offset their emissions? The recent case of Sabah and CA has raised some red flags with regard to this. What is your take on this?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in there. Yeah, so I deliberately didn't mention that recent Sabah case, but I am really encouraged that I did have some dialogue with the Sabah state government. And in fact, it's a former colleague, Daryl Weber, has been made the point person for the chief minister on these issues. And even though this NCA stands for Nature Conservancy Agreement. It raised a lot of red flags. It was before Dr. Darrell came in, and I have full confidence in what the Sabah government is doing at the moment, and I'm reassured by the statements of the Sabah State Attorney General regarding the NCA project. So yeah, I am optimistic in carbon credits in general, and also in Sabah's potential to come up with a credible scheme.
All right, thank you, Evelyn, for your question. And the next one is by Adrian. All states should have forest targets. Last I heard, Sarawak and Sabah are targeting to keep 50% of their forest. More to cut.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is the recommendation that all states should have targets. In terms of whether Sabah actually has a 50% forest target, I would say look at the document. It doesn't say that. It says forest and tree cover. And even though some politicians say, oh yeah, 50% forest, 50% forest, unfortunately, the devil is in the details, and you see that in the actual documents, it does not give that commitment. And the document, unfortunately, even though Sabah has some of the best forest management in Malaysia, there are issues in that the document does not define tree cover. And so presumably oil palm is included as in the 50% forest and tree cover, unless they come up with an explicit definition to say that tree cover includes such and such, excluding oil palm. We must assume that it includes oil palm. And this is particularly the case in Sabah because there have been more than 100,000 hectares inside permanent forests in Sabah that have been allowed to clear the natural forest and plant oil palm, despite the fact it's still a forest reserve, which actually makes things a lot more complicated because, I told you that the focus of our study now is looking at the legalities. But if you look at the actual vegetation that is inside some of these forest reserves, even though they're legally a forest, the vegetation is oil palm plantation, which, that is disturbing. But it's a somewhat separate issue.
Okay, and another question is, will you be sending the recording of the program afterwards?
All right, this is a good question. What I can commit to is that we'll make a social media announcement also on the RESCU website where we will upload the recording. The announcement will probably come out next week just to say what happened today, and there will be a link to the recording provided. And I'll make a special note to contact Tay Siu Yi.
Okay, and the next question is by Eric. Has Malaysian timber certification effectively stopped natural forest conversion into rubber plantations? How else can overseas markets support the necessary policy reforms?
All right, thanks, Eric, for a difficult question. All right, yes, yes and no. The Malaysian timber certification scheme only applies, in Peninsular Malaysia, it only applies to forest that's inside the forest reserves. And so there was conversion of natural forest to latex timber clone plantation, not rubber plantation. I need to get the terminology right. The timber latex clone or TLC plantations inside forest reserves. And so that was an issue that the latest decision of the National Land Council is no more, or is a moratorium on new approvals for such plantations inside forest reserves. But outside forest reserves, and remember I mentioned there's about 10% of Malaysia's land cover still as state land forest, which does not have such protection. And so that there's nothing stopping such areas of natural forest to be converted into rubber plantations. All right, and second question is, how else can overseas markets support? Yeah, I think Eric probably knows better than I do on what overseas markets can and cannot do. I think that the existing schemes such as timber certification, oil palm certification, they have had impact, although ultimately it really has to be on the Malaysian decision makers, the Malaysian politicians to change the system in Malaysia. We cannot rely on markets, and in some ways the markets can backfire because they can be said to be a foreign plot by the Western soybean growers. And so the markets can be useful, but they're not the full solution.
Okay, and the next question is from Fayez. Should federal have a say in carbon credit schemes done by states? How can this be done?
Yeah, well, the federal government has put forward several proposals and is developing a mechanism and has published several documents. The most relevant of which is the RED+. RED stands for Reducing Emissions from Forest Degradation and Deforestation, and plus includes other considerations such as conservation. And so the federal government is working on this issue, and should they have a say? I think they definitely should have the potential to play a coordinating role. I would say maybe the states should also have the right to pursue unilateral engagement with certain markets. But I think there is utility. It's useful to have the federal government to coordinate. And the two federal ministries that have been involved are KITSA and KASA. So that's the Environment Ministry and also the Ministry of Natural Resources.
Okay, and seems like the last question is from Surin. One key issue that has not been touched upon is forest monitoring and verification. Currently, the mechanism for monitoring and verification is not transparent. The figures are compiled by the Peninsular Malaysia Forestry Department, and they are in turn depending on the state forestry departments for the data. The state forestry departments are beholden to the respective state governments. Ideally, the monitoring and verification should be done independently by a federal authority or by an appointed credible third party. Your comment?
Yeah, so I think we should clarify that Surin is talking, and I think he's talking about the monitoring and verification of forest cover statistics. And also as these forest cover statistics relate to things such as our international reporting to the United Nations, and also our reporting to international treaties such as the Climate Change Treaty. So it's absolutely, I absolutely agree with him that our credibility rests on the fact that we have credible and consistent reporting. And one issue which he doesn't mention but is relevant is that the international definitions of forests do not match the definitions of forests used by the state forestry departments, because the state forestry departments normally use a legal definition. So if it's a forest reserve or protected area, it's considered to be a forest. And if it's an alienated land, as I mentioned, if it's an alienated land, whether it's a TLC or maybe even the timber plantations on private land, are not normally counted by the state forestry departments as forests. So in that respect, we are underselling ourselves in that we are not, we actually have more forests than the states are reporting, if you use the international definition. So the bottom line is there needs to be some kind of consistency, and the definition needs to match the definition used by the party that we are reporting to. And the normal approach used by other countries, and doesn't seem to really be used by Malaysia, is to use a combination of remote sensing and ground truthing to come up with the statistics. And that seems to be a gap at the moment, in that the figures do not seem to be based on remote sensing.
Okay, and we have another question by Faiz. I am informed that a recent Singapore academic paper stated our forest cover was only 45%. Could you comment?
Yeah, so this gets back to the definition of forest. And so that paper, I believe he's referring to a paper known as Mietinen and others, was produced by the Center for Remote Sensing, or CRISP, in Singapore, which is, and these were researchers and the NUS in Singapore. And they came up with their own definition of forest, which they are entitled to do, but we are under no obligation to follow their definition. So their definition was not in line with the United Nations definition, but some people could argue that their definition was more appropriate because it's based more on ecology. But again, it's kind of arbitrary. And I had to look at their paper, and their definition, they talk about natural forest, I think, then they define it as areas which haven't undergone industrial logging, which I'm not really sure I entirely agree with that definition. But they do raise a valid point in that you could come up with a vegetation cover, which is what I mentioned in my reply to Surin, is that if you assess forests based on satellites, you might actually come up with a figure for forests that is less than 50%. However, that paper, that Singapore paper, was a combination of satellite and also zoning. So it's it's sad that we cannot say with confidence. It's also sad that there's no universal definition for forest that everyone agrees to, and so we cannot say to everyone's satisfaction whether we are above or below this 50% pledge. Which it's an issue. It's unfortunate, but that's why we need to be very clear ourselves what we mean by forest. And unfortunately, the Malaysia forest policy does not come up with the definition for forest, a united national Malaysian definition for forest, which is one thing that we recommend in our report. We come up with a legal definition for forest, which it unites all of the states' definitions in Malaysia. It's a rather unwieldy definition because it includes dozens of legislations, but as far as I know, it's the first time there has been a united Malaysian definition for forest, and maybe it's a start.
Okay, it seems to be, that seems to be the last question.
All right, I can see a few in the chat.
It's just thank yous.
Okay. Yeah. All right. There's some interesting comments in the chat. So Yahua mentions he says he has seen a transcript of the speech that said forest cover, no mention of tree cover. Well, I think as Dr. Rahim mentioned, we need to be clear of which speech, because he made more than one speech in 1992. And in one of the speeches, Dr. Rahim is right in that he did mention tree cover in one of his speeches in 1992. But yeah, it underscores the point that you really can't trust the politicians based on their speeches. And some of the speeches might have been off the cuff, and off the cuff he might have said something else. Maybe he didn't follow the script. So the bottom line is we need to have it in black and white in an official policy, and not have to hunt down what the text of the speech said. Right, we've got. I think we can stick to the time. We've got 2 more minutes, so I'm just going to scroll down the comments if you don't mind. Okay, all right. The rest of the comments, just kind comments saying thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, problem tree rebranded theory of change. Good point, Surin. Yeah, I don't use either term. I'm just calling it systems thinking diagram, but it's more or less the same thing. It identifies problem and you turn it around and you can identify certain solutions, which is what I hope we've done. All right, so thank you, Divya. I think that's all from my side, and I should give some acknowledgements actually in my last slide. I think I just jumped over the acknowledgements. I want to thank the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, also South Asia Research Hub, and the British High Commission in Malaysia. Thank all of the respondents who kindly spoke with our team during the interviews. And also, I should mention Diva Lingam and co, the lawyers who were on our team. And then finally, thanks to all of you guys who attended today. I'm really pleased to see that we've got more than 70 participants turned up, which I hope have made it worth your while. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teckwyn, for your compelling presentation. Seems to be that the audience enjoyed it. And thank you to the audience members and to everyone who attended for your questions. Thank you for actively participating. And now I would like to call upon Edlyn Teo from the British High Commission to just say a few words. Edlyn, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi, I'm Adeline, the Economic Advisor at the British High Commission, Kuala Lumpur. From both the British High Commission and the South Asia Research Hub in Delhi. Thank you once again to RESCU for the great presentations, and to all the audience for the constructive comments and feedback. I have definitely learned a lot from this session, and I hope all of you have the same learning journey. The discussions we hear in this session also demonstrates the strong appetite and interest amongst our audience in strengthening sustainable land use management in Malaysia, as well as advancing the country's green economy ambitions. As the High Commissioner has said in his welcoming remarks at the beginning of this webinar, we hope that this study contributes to the knowledge base on the complexities around this subject, and that today's webinar takes a step towards that goal. On a broader climate agenda, the UK will continue to work with Malaysian actors from all levels of society on efforts to strengthen forest conservation and sustainable land use, and to support the achievement of Malaysia's green economy ambitions. And finally, I can only briefly mention that there is another further study that the British High Commission, together with the South Asia Research Hub, have commissioned, and will soon be completed by a different organization. This will be on the subject of economic instruments for climate action, including carbon pricing issues. So please do keep an eye on our social media, UK and Malaysia, for details of when that study will be presented to the public. So once again, thank you, RESCU, and I hope everyone have learned something and enjoyed the session today.
Thank you so much, Adeline. All right, then we've come to the end of our event. Thank you so much to His Excellency and to everyone involved in the study, including Dr. Teckwyn Lim. Thank you to all of the attendees, and everyone who participated today. Stay safe and have the good rest of your day.